Welcome to our deep dive, and today we're looking at the world of religion and government.
Okay.
And it's really interesting. We've got this fascinating mix of sources here. We've got biblical prophecy, historical analysis, and we've even got an opinion piece that basically says, is religion even real?
Yeah.
So we're going to be exploring all of that.
Right.
We're going to see how all these seemingly unrelated topics might actually be connected.
Uh-huh.
So for example, how do symbolic interpretations of these biblical beasts, like in the book of Daniel and Revelation, relate to actual historical empires?
Mm-hmm.
And could this concept of and this is really interesting to me, this concept of a Babylonian harlot in the book of Revelation have any connection to modern day restrictions on certain religions?
Yeah.
So let's dive in, see what we can uncover. What do you think? What's striking about this mix?
Well, I think what's really fascinating about these sources is how they encourage us to think about the interplay of power, both religious and political, across different historical periods.
Okay, so let's start with Daniel's vision of the four beasts. I got to admit, when I first read this part of the Bible, I was like, what is going on?
Yeah.
Giant beasts rising from the sea, a lion with eagle wings. I don't even know what to do with that.
Right.
Help me out here. What's that all about?
Well, I think for those who maybe aren't as familiar with the book of Daniel, it's a collection of prophecies and stories that were written during the Babylonian exile. And this particular vision that you're talking about, it's full of symbolism, but a lot of scholars believe it refers to actual historical empires.
Oh.
Each beast represents kind of a successive world power that, in one way or another, opposed God's rule.
So it's not just some fantastical story. These beasts actually symbolize real empires.
Yeah, that's the main interpretation that a lot of people take. And it's supported by historical analysis.
Interesting.
So we kind of break it down beast by beast.
Okay, let's do it.
So the first beast is a lion with eagle's wings, and that symbolizes Babylon.
Babylon, okay.
If you think about the characteristics of a lion, like powerful, majestic, a symbol of kingship, Babylon was the dominant empire in Daniel's time.
Right.
And their imagery often featured lions.
Gotcha. Okay, so what about the second beast? That one was a bear, right?
That's right, a bear.
Yeah.
And it's described as devouring much flesh. So that represents the Medo-Persian Empire that came after Babylon.
Uh-huh.
And Medo-Persia was known for its vast territorial expansion. So it kind of fits that image of a bear gobbling up everything in its path.
So are we seeing a pattern here? Each beast reflects the characteristics of the empire that it represents.
Exactly.
Okay.
That's the idea. So then the third beast is a leopard with 4 wings and 4 heads, and that symbolizes the Greek Empire under Alexander the Great.
Okay.
Alexander the Great, known for speed, military prowess, his empire conquered vast territories in a very short period of time.
Right.
And those multiple heads represent the division of the empire after Alexander died.
This is fascinating. So what about the fourth beast, the one that's described as terrifying and unlike any real animal?
Yeah, that one is often interpreted as the Roman Empire,
Okay.
the one that ultimately ruled Judea in Jesus' time.
Right.
And the Roman Empire was known for its iron-fisted rule and brutal military might. So it definitely fits the description of this monstrous beast with iron teeth.
Okay, so couldn't those symbols, though, be interpreted in other ways? It seems like there's a lot of room for subjective interpretation here.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There's always room for debate when it comes to biblical prophecy. And some scholars might propose different interpretations for these beasts.
Uh-huh.
But this connection to these 4 empires is really common in a lot of interpretations.
Mm-hmm.
And it helped us to understand the historical context of Daniel's vision.
Yeah, that makes sense. So are we saying that all of these empires, despite their differences, all had something in common?
Yeah, I think the main thing they had in common was they all stood in opposition to God's rule and persecuted his people. And this theme of worldly powers opposing divine authority, it's something that we see over and over in the Bible.
Okay. So how does this connect to the book of Revelation?
Right.
Didn't John also have a vision of a beast?
He did. Yeah, and it gets even more complex. John describes a 7-headed beast, kind of a composite of the beast that Daniel saw. And this beast represents the combined forces of political rule that oppose God's sovereignty.
Okay.
And it's described as having authority over every tribe and people and tongue and nation.
Wow. So this isn't just about one empire anymore. We're talking about a force that transcends national boundaries.
Right.
But isn't Revelation supposed to be about the end of the world?
Right.
Are we saying that these empires were all signs of the apocalypse?
Not necessarily. Revelation is full of vivid imagery and symbolism that can be interpreted in a lot of different ways.
Okay.
And this beast, the one in Revelation, could represent just the broader forces of evil and oppression that have existed throughout history and continue to exist today.
Okay, so let's try to unpack this a bit more. You mentioned something about a Babylonian harlot in Revelation. What's that all about?
Right. So in Revelation 17, John describes a woman who's called Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes,
Okay.
riding a scarlet-colored beast with 7 heads and 10 horns.
It's pretty wild imagery. I have to say, when I first read that, I wasn't sure what to make of it.
Right.
What does it all mean?
So it's a metaphor. And the term harlot is often used in the Bible to represent corruption and unfaithfulness.
Okay.
So in this context, Babylon the Great is interpreted as like a symbol of the world empire of false religion.
Okay, that makes a bit more sense. But why is false religion depicted as a prostitute?
Because it's accused of having immoral relations with political powers. It's portrayed as a corrupting force that compromises with worldly authorities for its own gain,
Okay.
engages in deception, idolatry, and persecuting true worshipers.
So essentially, it's like a symbol of spiritual corruption and compromise,
Yeah,
the opposite of what true religion should be.
exactly.
But how does any of this ancient symbolism, like how does it relate to what's happening in the world today? You mentioned something about countries banning specific religions.
Yeah, that's where we start to see some really intriguing parallels.
Oh, okay.
So one of the sources that you gave us highlights a growing number of countries that have outlawed certain religious groups in recent years.
Really? Like completely banned them?
Yeah?
But isn't freedom of religion supposed to be like a fundamental human right?
Yeah, it is, at least in theory,
Okay.
but the reality is a lot more complex.
So you're saying that, like, what might seem like a symbolic story from thousands of years ago could actually have relevance to current events.
Yeah, potentially.
That's pretty thought-provoking.
Yeah.
Can you give us some specific examples of these modern-day bans?
Sure. So one example is the Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia.
Okay.
They were officially banned in 2017, and their activities were criminalized as extremist.
Wow.
And then you have the Baha'is in Iran. They face severe restrictions and discrimination because their beliefs are considered heretical by the Islamic government.
It sounds like we're going to be exploring some pretty intense topics in this deep dive.
Yeah, I think so.
This is definitely giving me a lot to think about already.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting is it raises a lot of questions about how governments define extremism and deviance when it comes to religious beliefs. There's a lot of room for subjective interpretation there, which can very easily be used to target groups that simply hold different views.
Right.
So, where do you draw the line between protecting national security on the one hand and protecting fundamental freedoms on the other?
It's a delicate balance.
It is.
Yeah, it seems like that line between protecting national security and suppressing religious freedom, it can get pretty blurry.
Yeah, definitely.
But I'm still trying to wrap my head around how all of this connects back to those biblical prophecies.
Right.
Like, what's the tie-in here?
Well, I think it's definitely complex, but, remember how in Revelation, those 10 horns on the scarlet beast, they're said to hate the prostitute representing false religion and ultimately destroy her.
Yeah, that's a pretty disturbing image.
Yeah.
Are we suggesting that these modern day bans are like a fulfillment of that prophecy? Is that what our source is saying?
I think it's one possible interpretation. Our source does point out this trend of increasing restrictions on certain faiths.
Yeah.
And it's tempting to see that as a sign of what John was talking about centuries ago.
Right.
But we have to be really careful about drawing direct lines between those ancient texts and modern events.
So you're saying we shouldn't jump to conclusions.
Right.
There could be other explanations for why these bans are happening.
Exactly. So while some bans might be genuinely motivated by like security concerns
Okay.
or a real need to prevent violence,
Yeah.
others raise some serious questions about freedom of belief and whether political agendas might be exploiting religious differences.
That makes sense. It's, like you said earlier, there's a lot of room for subjective interpretation when it comes to defining extremism or deviance. One person's dangerous cult could be another person's legitimate faith.
Exactly. And that's why I think it's so crucial to have really open and honest conversations about these issues,
Yeah.
to try to consider different perspectives, to challenge our own assumptions.
Okay. So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about that prophecy in Daniel 11.45 that our source mentioned.
Right.
It talks about a king setting up camp between the Grand Sea and the holy mountain of decoration.
Right.
Our source seems to think this has something to do with the current war in Ukraine, but I'm having trouble seeing the connection, honestly.
Yeah, I can see why you say that.
Yeah.
The language in Daniel is often very symbolic.
Right.
It can be really difficult to decipher. So the Grand Sea likely refers to the Mediterranean Sea,
Okay.
and the holy mountain of decoration is probably Mount Zion in Jerusalem.
Okay. So we've got this king planting himself in a strategically important region. But who is this king? And how does any of this relate to Ukraine?
Yeah, that's where the interpretations get really murky. So Daniel doesn't explicitly name the king in that verse.
Right.
And there are a lot of different opinions on who he might represent. Some scholars believe it refers to a Seleucid king from centuries ago,
Okay.
while others think it points to a future ruler, maybe even a figure who's going to play a role in the end times.
So we could be talking about a historical figure or someone who hasn't even appeared on the world stage yet.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes it pretty hard to connect it to what's happening in Ukraine right now, doesn't it?
It does. And I think, our source doesn't provide a lot of concrete evidence for a direct link.
Yeah.
Maybe they're suggesting that the current conflict in Ukraine is destabilizing the region in a way that's going to create conditions for this prophesied king to emerge.
That's an interesting thought, but it seems like we're venturing into some pretty speculative territory here.
Yeah.
I mean, isn't it possible that we're reading too much into these prophecies? Could they just be symbolic stories that are meant to convey a broader message about the struggle between good and evil?
It's definitely a valid point. And I think it's important to remember that biblical prophecy is often open to multiple interpretations. So what one person sees as like a clear prediction of future events,
Right.
another person might view it as symbolic language that's just meant to inspire or warn.
So where does that leave us? Are we any closer to understanding how these ancient prophecies might be relevant to our world today?
I think what's important is that these prophecies encourage us to think critically about this interplay between power and religion.
Hmm.
Whether or not we believe in their literal fulfillment, I think they offer some really valuable insights into human nature and those kind of recurring patterns of history.
I appreciate that perspective. It's tempting to get caught up in trying to decipher every detail of these prophecies, but maybe the real value lies in the bigger questions they raise about faith and power and the human condition.
Exactly.
And speaking of questioning assumptions, we haven't even touched on that opinion piece that you mentioned earlier, the one that challenges the very existence of religion,
Oh, right.
the one that calls religion a made-up story about a made-up deity. That's a pretty bold statement. Do you think there's any merit to that argument?
It's definitely a perspective that a lot of people hold.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's important to acknowledge that throughout history, religion has been used to justify some horrific acts of violence, oppression, and discrimination.
Yeah.
But to just dismiss all religion as simply made up seems like an oversimplification to me.
Yeah, I can see both sides of that coin.
Yeah.
Religion can be a source of great comfort and inspiration for people, but it can also be twisted and distorted for really nefarious purposes.
Exactly. So for many people, religion provides a sense of meaning and purpose and moral guidance.
Right.
It can inspire acts of incredible love, compassion, and self-sacrifice. But it can also be used as a tool for control and manipulation and division.
It sounds like we're back to that theme of balance and perspective that we keep coming back to.
Yeah.
There's no easy answer when it comes to religion and its role in the world.
I agree. And I think it's also important to remember that, even within a single religion, you can have a vast spectrum of beliefs and interpretations.
Of course. Yeah.
You have fundamentalists who take every word of their holy book completely literally. And then you have people who see scripture as more allegorical, open to different interpretations.
Which, like anything else in life, really.
Yeah.
You've got extremists on both ends of the spectrum, and then you have this whole range of perspectives in between.
Yeah, and I think that diversity of thought is something to be celebrated, not feared. It's a reminder that even when we're discussing something as seemingly complex as biblical prophecy, there's always room for nuance and multiple viewpoints.
So as we delve deeper into these sources, what are some of the key questions that we should keep in mind?
I think one crucial question is whether this increasing number of bans on certain religious groups, does it reflect a larger global trend towards restricting or even eliminating religion?
Hmm.
Is this a sign that society is becoming more secular?
Yeah.
Or are we just seeing a backlash against globalization and the perceived erosion of traditional values?
And how does that relationship between religion and government play out on the global stage?
Right.
Are we heading toward a future where religious freedom is increasingly marginalized?
Yeah.
Or are we seeing a resurgence of faith in response to all the challenges of our time?
Those are tough questions.
Yeah.
There are no easy answers. But I think by examining these sources that you've given us,
Right.
we can at least begin to unpack these different perspectives and start to grapple with the implications for the future of faith and freedom.
That's what I appreciate about these deep dives, They
Yeah.
push us to think critically and challenge our assumptions. It's not about finding all the answers. It's about engaging with these complex issues and trying to make sense of them.
Absolutely. And I think the sources that you provided offer a really fascinating glimpse into this ongoing struggle between power and faith and individual freedom.
Hmm.
They remind us that the relationship between religion and government is this delicate dance,
Yeah.
a constant negotiation between that desire for order and the need for individual expression.
It seems like this dance between religion and government, it's getting even more complicated in the 21st century.
Yeah, I think so.
We're seeing this clash of values play out, like in real time with these bans on certain religious groups.
Yeah, you've hit on a really crucial point, and I think the sources that you provided really highlight how those in power, they can label any group that challenges their authority or deviates from the mainstream as a threat.
It's almost like history is repeating itself.
Yeah.
Something about the Roman Empire persecuting early Christians, but it's not just ancient history, is it?
Sadly, no. In recent times, we've seen governments use, like, the war on terror to justify cracking down on certain religious groups, even those that are advocating for peace.
That's what's so concerning, right? Like, if governments can just decide which beliefs are acceptable and which ones are extreme, what's to stop them from targeting any group that disagrees with them?
That's the danger of eroding religious freedom. It's not just about protecting minority faiths, but it's about safeguarding freedom of thought for everyone.
Right, because if we let governments control what people believe, we're essentially giving them the power to control our minds. That's a scary thought.
It is, and that path can very easily lead to totalitarianism, where the state dictates every aspect of life, including our personal beliefs.
So what can we do about it? Like, how do we push back against this trend of restricting religious freedom?
Well, I think it starts with awareness. We need to educate ourselves about what's happening around the world, understand the motivations behind these bans, and recognize the potential consequences for all of us.
And, like, speaking up against injustice. We have to advocate for those who are being persecuted and hold our own governments accountable for upholding religious freedom.
I completely agree. It won't be easy, though. There are very powerful forces, both political and religious, that benefit from controlling people and suppressing dissent.
But if we stay silent, we become complicit in this erosion of freedom. It's like we're choosing to ignore the warning signs that, maybe those biblical prophecies were trying to highlight.
Yeah, I think that's one of the key takeaways from our deep dive today. It's forced us to confront these really difficult truths and consider our own role in shaping the future of faith and freedom in the world.
It's definitely been an eye-opening conversation for me. I'm,
Sure.
I'm starting to see how these ancient texts, historical analysis, current events, like it all fits together.
It's a reminder that the relationship between religion and government is always evolving. It's this delicate balance that requires constant vigilance and a real commitment to defending fundamental freedoms for all.
So where do we go from here? What's like the next step for our listeners who want to explore these ideas further?
Well, I would encourage you to keep learning, keep questioning, keep engaging in these important conversations. Don't be afraid to challenge your own assumptions and seek out diverse perspectives.
And maybe take another look at those ancient texts with like fresh eyes.
Exactly. You might be surprised at the insights they offer into the challenges that we're facing today. The world is incredibly complex and there are no easy answers. But by diving deep, by engaging with those different viewpoints, we can at least start to try and make sense of it all.
Well, this deep dive has definitely given me a lot to think about. Thanks for guiding us through this complex and fascinating topic.
It's been my pleasure. Until next time, keep exploring and remember, the truth is often found in the depths.